You do not sacrifice the dignity of the person for the common good, and you don't sacrifice the common good for the dignity of persons.
Right. So if someone's asking you which one wins in the end, you're like, then You're seeing it wrong.
Or they're being pit against one another. What you've missed is something about the social order that is off. The dignity of the person and the common good are not in opposition with one another, but are a both and. And that if they seem to be in conflict, it means something is wrong with the order.
Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockel. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by my friend, Dr. David Cloutier, and as a Canadian, this is a very difficult thing for me to say. We always want to pronounce it in French, like foyer is a foyer here in Canada. But anyways, I've learned to say Dr. David Cloutier. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, and I'm sorry I'm from Chicago rather than Canada.
Well, we can forgive these things, but I'm delighted to have you here. You and I meet at conferences all the time, and we have lots of conversations around the kinds of things that folks in this community are interested in. And in particular, we've been at this conference in Notre Dame where you have recently moved, that the McGrath Institute for Church Life hosts on teaching life and human dignity. I do a presentation there on teaching every class from a Catholic point of view, and you have a sort of standing gig to do a presentation there on Catholic social teaching. So I thought, well, What a great opportunity to bring these two things together and talk to you about Catholic social teaching for our Catholic teachers. So why don't we just start with a little introduction from you about yourself? Who are you? Where do you work? What do you do? And in particular, what is Catholic social teaching? What role does it play in your life and work?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Brett, I've recently, just this past year, moved to the theology department at the University of Notre Dame, where I also have a concurrent appointment in the business school, trying to teach particularly undergraduate business majors a deeper vision of ethics and society than is often offered in business schools. It's a really wonderful program here at Notre Dame. And of course, I already knew many people doing great Catholic work here at Notre Dame. And so it's a great opportunity to join them. Before that, I taught for 8 years at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and then 10 years at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I have taught all across the spectrum of Catholic moral theology. My first book was actually on Catholic sexual ethics. But over the past 10 to 15 years, I've really moved strongly towards teaching Catholic social ethics, particularly interested in issues of economics, consumerism, and environmentalism.
Okay, very good. I didn't know the details that you had this, I don't know if this is the right word, but cross appointment or concurrent appointment in the business school. And this is really quite ideal, actually, because later in the podcast, we can talk a little bit about teaching economics or teaching business in a Catholic school. I think very often we think about Catholic social teaching in terms of teaching social studies, which of course, but I want to think about what it means in some other places. So if you're working in a business faculty, I think that's an ideal kind of connection. Can we start with thinking through, like, this is really basic and a lot of us are going to know this, but for those of us who don't, and a refresher is always helpful. What is Catholic social teaching? Where does it come from? And what are some key themes of Catholic social teaching that we should be thinking about before we get to the practical application of what it looks like in the classroom?
Right. That's a great question, Brett. And I actually think that we often don't spend enough time asking the question, what is Catholic social teaching? We assume we already know what it is, and that we ask the application question too quickly. Knowing something about the history of why the church developed a social teaching is very important. Obviously, the Old Testament, Jesus in his ministry, the early church fathers, Thomas Aquinas, they all have things to say about society, about justice, about things that we think of as social issues. But when we talk about Catholic social teaching, we're focused on a tradition that is often embodied in books like this, and that is often identified with Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century. In fact, Catholic social thought goes back probably to the French Revolution, which is an enormous crisis for the church in relationship to her most Catholic of European societies. And so provokes a great crisis about how the church is going to relate to the modern world and modern governments, including governments that are hostile to the church's mission. And over the course of the 19th century, there isn't clarity about where the church is going to go or how it's going to do that. But it's really with Pope Leo in the late 19th century that the church finds its footing and says, aha, we have figured out the way we're going to address society and the modern world. It's not going to be in the same register as the way in which the early church addressed society, or particularly the way in which the church addressed society in the Middle Ages, when the church, at least in Europe, seemed like the dominant power. So it's a particularly novel modern tradition, novel in a good sense, modern tradition of the church saying, how do we speak to modern society, modern political orders, modern economic orders in ways that can be most effective and consistent with the gospel?
Right. Well, let me jump in with an idea for history teachers, actually, because before we apply it to current events, knowing where it comes from, if you study the Industrial Revolution, it's in our history curricula. Right. I don't know how many Catholic high schools in their study of the Industrial Revolution say, the labor question right. that sort of convulses Europe with industrialization and these various things, right, is a major factor in the development of Catholic social teaching and the church's response to these kinds of questions, and Rerum Novarum, which is the first encyclical often listed in this tradition. So I found your framing very helpful. The church is in a new cultural situation relative to the rest of the culture, and there's economic developments that are novel, and we need to find a new way to speak. Of course, it's going to be rooted in Scripture, the fathers, the scholastics, but all of those people were speaking in a different time and place, in a different cultural context, a different economic context. So even just to label that I don't know particular details about the French Revolution, but to even say what's going on in the French Revolution that leads to a crisis in the church's sense of how does it speak to the world, right?
Yes. So your example of the Industrial Revolution and the history is very appropriate. If you actually look at the 19th century, you see that the church's initial response to the suffering of the poor is to the works of mercy, which is the traditional response. You see a rise of religious orders. You see a rise of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, for example, and Frederick Ozanam in France. lay Catholics attempting to get out in the world and figure out ways to minister to this new industrial population. But what happens? Well, part of what happens is that Marxism comes along, and I don't mean to make a boogeyman out of this, meaning a structural critique comes along. That is, you have people in the society who are saying it's all well and good to feed the poor, but let's ask questions about why the world is actually this way. And of course, Marxists had answers to the fact that the world was this way structurally, and that if you were going to overcome poverty, you needed to ask structural questions. And Catholics realized that they had to answer those structural questions too, but that they had different answers than the Marxists, right? And that those answers were not going to exclude the works of mercy, but that they required more thinking in order to formulate a response to the conditions of modern industrialism that would be an appropriate response and would be able to rival Marxism as a response to those structures.
Right. I love that you said, we have to answer the same questions, but we give different answers, because there's a temptation, I think, to think if you ask structural questions, then you're Marxist. Like we should be focusing on, the traditional answer, right? Works of mercy. But that asking structural questions is kind of already a little dangerous, right? And so and this is maybe something we can talk about later, but yeah. I find one of the problems in communicating Catholic social teaching is different political options want to sort of hive off part of it and claim it as the Christian thing. And it's remarkable how much it looks like left-wing politics when some people use it, and how much it looks like right-wing politics when other people use it. And I found your way of framing it kind of cuts through the temptation to do that, right?
I think if I can be candid near the beginning of this podcast, Brett, if you hear someone presenting Catholic social teaching as if it is fully consonant with one party or the other, or with the political left and the political right, then they are making a mistake. I will just say full stop. They are making a mistake. Where the mistake is, I think, ends up being complicated. But in fact, what Catholic social teaching is supposed to be doing is presenting a distinctive account of society that might be compatible with a whole set of policy packages, but is likely to challenge standard policy packages from the modern left and the modern right, as it has from the beginning.
Right. Well, let's circle back to the question of polarization later in the podcast. Sure. As we're still relatively early in the podcast, can you spell out some of the key themes? Like sometimes you'll see a poster in a classroom with like 8 or 4, pillars or central themes of Catholic social teaching. So let's lay out a few of those and get some clarity on what they mean, and maybe in some cases it'll be helpful to say what they don't mean.
Sure. Well, there are many different lists of the principles of Catholic social teaching. So we are at a disadvantage compared to, say, the 10 Commandments or the Beatitudes or the works of mercy or the sacraments. And I could go on. These are standard lists that have commanded agreement in the Catholic tradition over time. The difficulty with Catholic social thought is that there is not a standard list of the principles. The most common list that I see now has 4 principles: the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Each of those principles is important, but it is difficult to start with the principles because underlying those principles is actually a vision of the social nature of the person. So when I explain Catholic social thought, I try to point out that in order to really think like a Catholic, you have to understand what Catholicism has to say about the social nature and destiny of the person. And then you can understand why it is that there are these principles and what these principles mean and don't mean.
Right. Well, so let's dive into that. And then let me just think out loud for a second. So the 4 you picked, which I've seen that list too. Very often when there's other lists that are typically longer, like the 4 is the short list, right? Mm-hmm. When there's other lists that are longer, typically the other pieces will fit, right? Care for creation is often on the list. Yes. Well, that falls pretty clearly under common good and has some relationships with some of the other pieces. So it's not like they're not on the list. It's just that they fall under, different umbrellas depending how you organize it. But I think you're right that to make sense of any of them, any list that we might choose, that we need to start with the question of the nature of the human person, and in particular, the social nature of the human person. So let's do that for a minute. Let's talk about the church's vision of the human person in community, and then maybe walk through those 4 on the list that you gave.
Yeah. So the church's vision of the social nature of the person challenges 2 modern forms of thinking about society that Pius XI names as individualism and collectivism. And individualism suggests that our nature as human persons is to be individuals who then make choices to connect with or contract with people in order to do things with them. But it is not necessarily in our nature to be in social relationship. Rather, social relationship has to come after individuals. They have to make contracts with one another.
Right.
Collectivism is the opposing view that suggests that, in fact, human people are simply parts of various kinds of cultural wholes, and their activities can only be understood in terms of being cogs in some kind of a larger system, whether you call that system capitalism or whether you call that system colonialism or whether you call that system white supremacy. I mean, there is no shortage of these kinds of views of society as collectivist, in the sense that humans are to be seen as parts of a whole.
Right. And you can see already how this is going to distort the reception of Catholic social teaching. If you've bought a typically right-wing anthropology that views us as individualists, then whatever you read in the common good or the dignity of the human person or whatever is going to be skewed by that. And if you read the more left-wing lens of collectivism, it's going to right. So I can see why you say you need to start with this, because if you go with either of those unwittingly, you're on the wrong foot before you start.
So where you want to start is where the secular psychologist Jonathan Haidt begins when he says human beings are groupish.
Okay.
That is to say that we don't have to be persuaded to join communities and take part in communities. We are naturally oriented to do it. And given that we grow up in families, we start in community. We don't start as individuals. We start in social units. But it is important to see that those social units are, in fact, oriented towards common action, towards common goods.
Right.
So my example that I use whenever I teach this is the example of a sports team or a musical ensemble. And what the church wants to say in its social teaching is it is natural for humans to form communities like orchestras, like schools, like churches, like businesses, like various volunteer organizations, that all of those kinds of groups where we collaborate with other human beings towards some kind of common end, those are inherent and intrinsic to what it means for us to be human.
Right.
Those aren't additive.
Right.
The state doesn't have to convince us to do these things. We're not Robinson Crusoe on a desert island.
Right.
And then we have to decide whether we're going to be in relationship to other people. In fact, we're made for these kinds of relationships with other people.
And we don't just do it because we need something, right? It's
correct.
It's not just because it's harder to feed yourself if you grow your own food. Therefore, you're forced into some sort of contract with the other who doesn't have your good at heart, or, something like that, right?
Right.
Which is a certain kind of anthropology that grows out of, various Enlightenment thinkers or that sort of thing, right?
Yes. So it's natural for us to form communities in this way. And part of the challenge of the modern era, as I pointed out, on these two extremes of individualism and collectivism, is that in different ways, they both want to question the naturalness of our social nature. They either want to impose community from without, top-down community, you might say, or they want to say that we simply voluntarily go out and form these kinds of communities that we're interested in.
Right.
In either case, our nature is not actually so intrinsically social in this way. And so, to cut to the chase, the social nature of the person means that we have to preserve and foster these natural human communities.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of the theological angle, right? So the creation story, it is not good that man should be alone, being sort of one sort of locus in Scripture, but then also the doctrine of the Trinity, right? We're made in God's image and likeness, and God is community. If you're a Christian and you believe in the Trinity, to be made in God's image is to be made for community already. That's built in.
And we should think about what the Trinity as a community means. So in Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 24, this connection to the social nature of the person with the Trinity is made, and it is about our desire to give ourselves to others. Now, the language of self-gift is language that in Catholicism we often associate specifically with the family, and we should. But in fact, all of these natural human communities involve reciprocal self-gift. So Benedict in Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate, his 2009 encyclical on the economy, insists that we need quotas of gratuitousness or quotas of gift in order for any economic enterprise to succeed, even as an economic enterprise.
Right.
So what he means, of course, is he means we need our workplace to be a place where if some emergency happens to our kid, we can count on our coworkers to kind of jump in and maybe cover for us. Right. Even though they don't have to, even though it's not in their contract, in various kinds of ways, we need those kinds of reciprocal self-gifts in our business community. And if our business community is the kind of business community that discourages that, right? If the larger economy is so harsh that companies can't actually allow these quotas of gratuitousness, or if we go into every business transaction attempting to gain every dime of maximum advantage that we're able to gain, then we're not actually going to be able to give ourselves to other people in some kind of a cooperative enterprise.
Right.
And that's what Catholic social teaching wants to say is our nature. We need to have societies where we do that and not just the family.
But this is helping me think about things that I'm jumping ahead, but things I want to ask you later when we think about not just social studies, if the connection in Gaudium et Spes 24 between our being made in the image and likeness of God and Catholic social and this anthropology is being ordered towards self-gift, it seems to me that shows up in art class, music class, phys ed, business. Like if you're trying to make sense of a human activity, what are you doing when you make a song or a piece of art or you're practicing with a group of teammates towards some goal? to win the city championship or whatever it is, right? All of those things can make more sense in light of the human ordering towards self-gift, right? And like the example you just gave is within a business context, which I think is a great one too, to think of business not primarily as where I get profits, though of course I want to make some money and feed my family, but where I offer something to the world, right? And business is a vehicle through which I can make a gift of myself, right?
So I would say your insight about the fact that this could happen in any class at younger ages, I actually think the way you do this is trying to help students as much as possible do stuff together that they like to do together.
I love how simple it is. Yes. But this is very often the case, actually, when working with elementary school teachers. And the question is, like, how do we do this Catholic stuff in elementary school? And a lot of the answer is like, pay attention to what actually works with young people. And like notice what you're doing and how Catholic that is, and the things that work tend to be pretty consonant with a Catholic worldview, right?
Right. So doing stuff together that people like to do together, and the doing together part is really important. Not just doing each individually doing things in the same space, but doing something that involves cooperation. I think it's very important. So I grew up singing in a choir, and we also had a community theater troupe at our parish. And I think things like choral singing and community theater troops are great examples, great schools for Catholic social thought, because you realize that the entire interaction that is going on there is aimed at you somehow working with other people that you like, or sometimes don't always like, but you work together because you like the same good, and you need to do this thing that is inherently done together. For other people, it might be sports.
Right.
But Brett, if I could just add to this also means that you need to resist certain ways of doing activity that discourages this approach. So I would highlight two, but you can probably go beyond this. One is you should discourage activity where everybody does their own thing. So I have to admit, this is one of my anxieties about screens in education right now. It's not just the screen time problem. I think it is that we have moved towards thinking that interaction with the screen can replace interaction with other people. As I speak to you across perhaps across national boundaries and speak to other people, this can be effective, of course, but for kids in a classroom, right, you don't want them doing their own thing on the screen. You don't want them want them watching their own podcast. You want them doing stuff together. And the same thing is true about artistic projects or musical projects. The temptation to just let everybody do their own thing, I think, should be resisted. They need to learn how to do things together. But here comes the big but. But then the other thing is you have to figure out how not to plan every moment of the classroom so that everything that is done together is somehow planned carefully from the top down.
Right. And sometimes you could do the worst of both worlds. You can have like the individualist and the collectivist mistake almost simultaneously, right? We'll put you all on your screens, and then I will conduct. We're all playing the same game or whatever it is via the screen or something, and I will sort of conduct it from the lead chair. And so now we're individualists and collectivists almost at the same time, but we don't talk to each other.
Right. Yes. So these are all excellent examples. And what I want to point out is if students come to see that they are fulfilling their social natures through these beloved activities, then when we get to the principles, we will be able to demonstrate the principles. What is a common good? We will be able to demonstrate what a common good is by pointing to their experience in groups that actually cooperate with one another towards goods in common.
Right. Beautiful. So I do something very similar with science, actually. Like I talk to teachers about laying certain principles through the students' observation of their own experience of the material world, that when they get to be grade 9 or 10 or whatever grade they study evolution, it looks like the way that the God they've been introduced to in grade 2 works, instead of looking like a new God who doesn't work this way and is now a crisis for their conscience. And I think the same basic principle here is when you work with elementary school kids, you give them a certain set of experiences that allows them to reflect on what that was like. And then the principles which you introduce at age appropriate times, whatever it is, grade 9 or 10 or whatever, they have like a perch on which to land. Because you can ask, say, hey, remember when you did this, right? And your examples of a choir or a theater troupe, well, if they've had an experience of that, then you can talk to them about the principles in light of that experience. But if they haven't, it's very difficult.
Yes, and it also prevents the temptation to think that Catholic social thought is only about policy and political issues.
Yes.
That when we suddenly talk about the common good, it means we're talking about elections and hot button issues and things like that. And that's actually a key place where I think things go off the rails. You must start from the ground. And the ground is the existence of what Russell Hittinger, who's one of the best philosophers out there on this, he calls them group persons. So what he's describing when he's describing a community theater troupe or a classroom that truly works together is, he says, these are group persons where there's a cooperative order. People have to work together like on a team, and they're working together towards a truly common goal, not towards their own individual goal, but towards some kind of a common good. And that they have this experience of what it means to be in solidarity with other people, what it means to have appropriate levels of authority. A coach, for example, knows when to step in and when to let other teammates, for example, kind of nudge along the guy who's not performing or do the help, right? The good coach practices subsidiarity when he recognizes sometimes the coach steps in and sometimes the coach holds back and lets the team work out this problem by themselves.
Right. Well, let's move then to those 4 pillars, and could we tackle them in 2 pairs? Because it seems to me you can make more sense of subsidiarity when you talk about solidarity and vice versa. And I think the same thing with the first 2. The common good, which maybe some listeners are thinking, okay, like this theater troupe thing makes sense in terms of the common good. Right. But what does it mean for the dignity of the human person? So does it make sense? Is yes. My intuition right that we can tackle them as two pairs?
I think that's a very constructive way to go at the principles. The first pair, the dignity of the person and the common good. Gaudium et Spes is explicit about the fact that this is the most important both and. You do not sacrifice the dignity of the person for the common good, and you don't sacrifice the common good for the dignity of persons.
Right. So if someone's asking you which one wins in the end, you're like, then You're seeing it wrong.
Or they're being pit against one another.
Right.
That you're seeing it, and when you say you're seeing it wrong, I think there's a further insight that you can press on here, which is to say what you've missed is something about the social order that is off. Something is wrong on a team if the team cannot simultaneously seek the common good, something that's truly in common, and have everyone be treated with dignity on the team. Indeed, ordinarily in team contexts, we think about the fact that in order to pursue the common good together, we just expect everyone to treat everyone else with dignity, their teammates, right? So that ideally shows that the dignity of the person and the common good are not in opposition with one another, but are a both and that if they seem to be in conflict, it means something is wrong with the order.
Right. Let's look then at the second pairing, subsidiarity, solidarity. You've already mentioned subsidiarity in terms of, when the coach steps in and when the coach backs off. I remember I was having Christmas dinner one time. We had these lengthy political conversations with cousins that only see each other once or twice a year. And most of them are far from the church. And at one point I said something about, it makes a lot of sense if you do, how did I say it? You do things at the lowest level possible and the highest level necessary. Something like that. Classical, articulation of Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity. And all these people who are very far from the church were like, whoa, yeah, we should totally do that. Like, that's so brilliant. That makes sense. And then I was like embarrassed. I was like, that's Catholic teaching. Like, I had to say it like sotto voce, right? Because it was like, you're not supposed to be playing that game here. Anyways, this is a sidelight. One of the things about Catholic social teaching is when people hear it, they like it.
Yes.
Like, they find it compelling. And something like subsidiarity, which most people have like vaguely heard the word, once you explain it, they're like, oh yeah, the world works way better when you do that right. Talk to us a little about solidarity and subsidiarity.
Yeah, I just wanted to also flag, everybody wants the dignity of the person and the common good to be compatible, unless they're like a real misanthrope. If they're just like, I only care about myself, or right. I want to sacrifice people's dignity for the common good. Like, in fact, most people think, well, both of those are bad options.
Right.
Similarly, I think solidarity and subsidiarity are a both and, but they are a tricky both and. I like to describe this as that Catholic social thought thinks that we achieve solidarity through subsidiarity. So this avoids a balancing metaphor where we think we need to balance things, which the highest, lowest language can sometimes get into a balancing metaphor, right? We need just enough solidarity, but not too much solidarity. And I'm like, okay, we don't, and you didn't say that, Brett, so I'll be clear. But the balance metaphor can make it tempting to be like, okay, we need a spoonful of subsidiarity and a spoonful of solidarity. No, we need totally both of them. And if we think about solidarity through subsidiarity, I think we can see how this is a both and. So let me explain. I've already pointed out the social nature of the person means that we are fulfilled in these community relationships. Solidarity is a recognition of that fulfillment, that in fact, we need to be in relationship with other people in order to be fulfilled. But we only come to recognize it if we can preserve these small groups. We do not experience solidarity with lots and lots of other people. So John Paul famously defined solidarity as, we are all really responsible for all. Yes, John Paul really wrote that. We are all really responsible for all. So you cannot learn that lesson if you take it literally. If you think what John Paul means there is that I am supposed to feel a social responsibility for 2 billion other people on the planet, that I will be overwhelmed, as most people are overwhelmed when they deal with that. But if I say, well, what you mean by we are all really responsible for all is what we mean in this classroom when we say, when we all work together towards a common end, that we all take mutual responsibility for one another. You can say, oh, yes, I get that. How do I scale it up? So you need the subsidiary relationships, the groups, the smaller groups, the families, the classrooms, the community theater troops, in order to teach people what solidarity is.
Right. I'm thinking of the virtue signaling on social media, where
Oh,
it's easy to be in solidarity with any victim group anywhere in the world, and you never have to meet a human being that whose difficulties might like demand something of you. And
right.
I think what's the line from one of John's letters, right? He who says he loves God who he can't see, but doesn't love his brother and sister who he can see is a liar. And I'm like, you can kind of transpose that and say those who say they love humanity who they can't see,
Right.
but don't love their brother and sister who they can see is a liar, right?
Correct. I think that's very consonant with this, and that helps us see that lofty um, lofty ideals of human solidarity, which the church certainly traces back to the French is thinking about the French Revolution, various kinds of socialist revolutions. These are all in the name of solidarity.
Right.
But where they fundamentally fail is that they attempt to organize society from the top down and eliminate the lumpiness of subsidiarity. I'm sorry. They'll eliminate the lumpiness of subsidiarity. That is the fact that society is filled with lots of different groups. And I don't just mean groups like culturally diverse people. I actually mean orchestras and community theater groups and businesses. And they're all different, and they all run in different kinds of ways. And that top-down strategies actually wreck your society. They don't produce solidarity. They produce division, conflict, and eventually societal breakdown. And that the wisdom of the church is to say the way you actually build solidarity in society is from the ground up. That is, you teach people civic responsibility and belonging and care for other people in their neighborhoods, in their schools, in their business places. And then when they learn those lessons, they can start to say, well, maybe we should do this in our whole city. Maybe we should do this in our state. Maybe we should do this on larger scales.
Right, right. And there are particular kinds of problems that are more subject to treatment at the larger scale
Correct.
than others. I remember the last time we were together, I was listening to your talk and you mentioned airlines. It's tough for a village to have an airline, right? An airline requires a certain scale to be a functional kind of a thing, right? Whereas I grew up in a town with 150 people. We had a fire department. Now it was a small scale fire department, right? It was only volunteers, and there was like a pump house, and like a couple times, I don't know, a month, people went to check to make sure everything was working. And like once a year, we'd do like a little run just in case. So we knew it was all going. And we would hope the fire department from the bigger town next to us would get there soon, but we could fend it off for a little bit by ourselves, right? Anyway, it just strikes me as like those are very practical examples of like dealing with things at the appropriate level. But we had nothing like an airline, right?
Yes. Yeah, and dealing with those things at an appropriate level means that we recognize that there are larger problems, particularly in areas like energy, heavy industry, larger scale international relations. We could go
Security.
on. And of course, the environment, where activities of small groups can't coordinate, cannot generate the kind of outcomes that are necessary unless there is larger coordinated action. So economists will talk about collective action problems. And all a collective action problem really is in Catholic social teaching is a case where you need help from above. Because if you don't get help from above, each individual group does its own thing. So I like to use I'm a sports fan, so I like to use the example of a salary cap. Most of professional sports leagues now have salary caps, which players are not that happy about. But the reason that you have a salary cap is because you have a collective action problem which is that each team is incentivized to spend as much as possible to make their team good, right? Wouldn't you want that for your team? Right. But what happens if each team spends as much as possible for
Juan
the
Soto?
What? Juan Soto, yes.
Juan Soto happens.
So in baseball, right, they attempt to do it with taxation. But what it means is that you don't have a competitive league. So what's crucial for the sport is that they actually want a league where all the existing franchises have at least some plausible hope that they will be competitive with other franchises, right? And that ends up being the common good of the league. And in order for that collective action problem to be overcome, there has to be some kind of action at the league level to say, here are the rules for forming your team.
Right. So let's dive in. I love you've got so many great examples, and they're coming from, if we think in terms of the disciplines we study in school, they're coming from a variety of disciplines. That one was phys ed and business, kind of combined, right? I think for a lot of us, we're going to assume that the first and easiest place to deal with Catholic social teaching is in social studies class, where we study current events, right? So questions about Catholic teaching on immigration, or if an election is coming up, what's Catholic teaching about voting and all that kind of stuff. And I think, in fact, it's one of the only areas where there's a good number of resources that have been published in this area. In a lot of these places, there's very few resources for approaching a subject from a Catholic point of view. But social studies and Catholic social teaching is one place where there is some. What kinds of advice would you have for the social studies teacher in approaching, let's say, current events? Let's say, that's a common thing we do in social studies class. If you were teaching social studies in a Catholic high school or middle school and doing some current event stuff, how might you bring Catholic social teaching to bear on what's going on in your classroom?
One thing that would be valuable would be to take a look at the McGrath Institute's website. Again, this is the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And they have a program of teaching human dignity. And I've worked with their instructional designers to design a mini curriculum on the common good. That is trying to describe carefully, with lots of good examples and scaffolded lesson plans, how to convey the common good, and it's oriented towards social studies teachers. So I would encourage people to check that out at the McGrath's website as an example of what you might do. Your question aimed at particular issues.
Right. And I think maybe your unit, like, you can do something like that early in a semester, and that actually lays the foundation for you to be able to tackle the other things that come up, because you have the theoretical, foundations in place about what we mean by the common good. So when immigration shows up in the news, for example.
Yeah. So let's talk about immigration, because it has shown up, certainly in the United States, shown up in the news very strongly. The church in the United States has a particularly deep pastoral investment in the issue of immigration because of the emerging Hispanic majority in United States Catholicism. Here, we also struggle, though, with two competing temptations. Some Catholics will present Catholic social teaching in a way that makes Catholic social teaching an endorsement or rejection of a particular policy.
Right.
I call it the rush to policy problem.
Right.
Which is that you go past the principles and you assume that the church definitively is pro-immigrant, which I think is a fair description. Right. It certainly believes in the right to migration, and it believes that all people, regardless of their nationality or ethnic origins, have fundamental dignity. So at that level, it seems to me not anti-immigrant. It's not anti-person. But they say the church is pro-immigrant, therefore, and then you have a particular policy that they say the church must be against this policy or the church must be for this policy. And that is often rushed.
Right.
On the flip side of that, you have people who suggest that issues like immigration are merely a matter of prudential judgment. They will talk about prudential judgment very often. And this will be in contrast, say, to abortion or euthanasia, where there are moral absolutes that the church teaches. But they will imply that prudential judgments means that Catholics can believe in any immigration policy they want. It doesn't matter. The Catholic Church has nothing to say about immigration policy, which is also wrong. So you have the rush to policy approach, and then you have the prudential judgment approach, and it's almost like, the Goldilocks problem. One of them is too ready to get into the
prescription
model, and the other one is too reluctant to get into the prescription model.
Right.
I think the right way to respond to this is to try to frame issues in terms of certain deeper convictions that we must hold on to regardless of policy differences.
Right.
So on immigration, I think I've already indicated that the church clearly teaches that there is a right to migrate. It can be regulated, but that it is right and reasonable for people to migrate in search of a better life for themselves and their family.
Right.
And that every person, regardless of their nationality or citizenship status, has dignity. They must be treated with dignity. They are brothers and sisters to us, as the joint statement of the U.S. and Mexican bishops. The U.S. and Mexican bishops entitled a statement, I think from the late 90s, called Brothers and Sisters to Us, right? And a recognition that at a fundamental level, regardless of your views about policy, you need to recognize the basic dignity of immigrants.
Right. The two things that are really jumping out at me, this idea of the rush to policy, I think this is worth thinking about, because one of the temptations for teachers maybe, but I think for students too, is like, just tell me what the church says. Like, is it the right policy or not?
Right.
Does the church say Trump should deport all these people or not? And then you just say yes or no. And a couple things happen when you rush to policy, a whole bunch, but two that really stand out for me. One is the church's credibility just got put on the line by getting yoked to a policy. And policies are things that are tough to predict how they're going to work out. Right. And so when you endorse a policy because you're pro-immigrant, therefore any policy that imagines itself as pro-immigration therefore gets a stamp, then you could have really sloppy policy that's got good intentions, that gets a stamp of approval, and then the church is going to wear whether that works out or not. And you don't allow the possibility for a healthy, we agree on the principle, but I have questions about how this might work in practice. And that kind of important conversation gets disqualified because you're unfaithful if you're raising questions. So I think one thing is tied to credibility, and then another is creativity. If instead you say, like, here's the problem, and here's some principles of Catholic social teaching, and here are a variety of policy proposals that people have made. How do they stack up? And how might you make your own proposal? I mean, if we think we have to side with a given proposal, yay or nay, we really limit our capacity for creative thinking, that we want our graduates to go on to come up with less divisive, less sort of one-sided, less ideological kinds of policy proposals.
Right.
We want them to be able to do this. So let's start in grade 9, not giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to this policy in toto, but thinking about the principles and how they may or may not be achieved in this way or that way. And, anyways, it's just the rush to policy thing, I think, is a real dangerous temptation. And I think from a practical point of view, what you do in the classroom really should avoid that rush to policy for a few reasons.
Yes, and especially encouraging people to think more deeply about where the problems really are. In our culture, I think is particularly valuable because people often do not think deeply about these matters, sadly, on both sides of the spectrum. Again, sadly. And that there are deeper issues that can be brought out if you push people to try to get to a stance that is more appreciative of the deeper moral truths involved.
Right. And policies become proxy questions for moral absolutes, and then that's just a category confusion. Like we can say, abortion is a moral absolute. There's lots of different policies that might help reduce the abortion rate.
Correct.
And some of them will work better than others. And not doing the careful work to think that through and allowing healthy debate about that because it's a moral absolute is a category mistake that leads to, again, the church's credibility being hurt and doesn't save any babies, actually. But ends up allowing different people to pose as heroes for this or that side of some political issue. It doesn't hurt certain parties' ability to fundraise with certain groups, right? It does all those kinds of things and doesn't necessarily save lives, right?
Correct. And not only does it not save lives, it ignores the fact that even Thomas Aquinas insists that there is always a judgment of political prudence when it comes to making laws for a whole population. In other words, you cannot root out all vice through law. He's very clear about this, that it's kind of like pulling up the weeds with the wheat. And so you're always making judgments about essentially realistic policy or policy that is necessary to safeguard the most basic things. And I'm fairly persuaded by people who believe that issues like abortion and euthanasia have a certain claim on our attention as Catholics because they involve choices about life and death. Right.
Yeah, there's a certain preeminence.
Yeah, and so issues like in vitro fertilization or even contraception, where Catholics also believe these things are intrinsically wrong, but they don't usually go around lobbying for governments to outlaw these treatments, or maybe they will, but they make prudential judgments about what to do. And in any society where abortion and euthanasia already exist as routinely accepted practices by a substantial portion of the population, there's going to be prudential judgment about then how to legislate in a context where people have
right. And even let's say we all agreed, 90% of people thought abortion should be outlawed. There's still a question of prudential judgment about what does that law look like? How are infractions of that law punished? My point is, you can't avoid prudential judgment. Even in the most extreme case, if you had the legislative power and the political will of the people to say that this absolute moral question should be determined in this direction, that's just the beginning of a series of prudential judgments about how this actually works out in practice. And I feel like that often gets lost when we deal with moral absolutes. We should be able to uphold the moral absolute and still think carefully about policy, because policy is not a direct referendum on a moral question, right?
Yes, and what would be helpful, I think, for high school students is if they could see articulate Catholics who took their faith seriously and who were relatively knowledgeable about a policy question actually differ in their views. So if you actually had some kind of piece of curriculum or some kind of reading where you could read two different takes on the immigration situation. And when I say takes, I don't mean hot takes. I mean, say somebody in a more conservative Catholic journal like First Things and a more liberal Catholic journal like Commonweal, where you would read intelligent Catholics trying to think through these problems and coming to different conclusions. And that might be okay, but you also might then learn something about the deeper issues.
Right. And it's not a matter of, this person agrees with church teaching and this person doesn't, and we're providing a plurality of views by having the dissenter's voice in there. Like, it's a different thing than that. These are two faithful people who are approaching prudential questions with different considerations and different ideas. And that in itself is a very valuable kind of a thing.
Right.
You and I think we could do this for a long time, and this is a lot of fun. But social studies, as I said, I think is an obvious place to do this. But let's think about a handful of other subjects, right? Where does Catholic social teaching come into play? We've mentioned phys ed or school sports as great examples of subsidiarity, art and business as places of being ordered towards the gift of ourselves, all that kind of thing. Do you have any other ideas for subject areas where Catholic social teaching might come into play in a way that maybe the audience, isn't necessarily expecting?
Yeah, I think history is an important place, not only for the things that we mentioned early on in the podcast about the history of Catholic social thought in particular, but I also think that it is important for students to gain a sense of the different ways communities have gone about solving problems and overcoming crises. I think that it can be very tempting to the dominance of the presence is the dominance of the present is probably even worse now than when I went to school, to be honest. But even then, it was still pretty dominant in the sense that you saw the parameters of the society around you, and it was very difficult to think outside those parameters. And while we're much more culturally sensitive today, I don't think that means we're very culturally knowledgeable. That is, I don't think we think through, well, how did other earlier Western cultures work through certain kinds of problems? Or how did the American populists deal with various kinds of issues of farmers in the late 19th century? It's very instructive stuff, and it actually gives birth to some unexpected social changes that are very effective. So I think in history you can see people acting even if they don't know it on Catholic social principles, and that it can be very illuminating to students.
Right. I'm just thinking of Prohibition, which was not Catholic, but it was Christian. So right, the Temperance League,
right,
sort of Christian social activism. I mean, that's one example.
It was very anti-Catholic, in fact.
Right. Yeah. So the Catholics were the ones who were drinking, right?
Yes.
And then running the alcohol once the amendment was passed. But it just strikes me as like, that's an example from an American history, textbook that you would learn about Christian social action. But there's probably Catholic examples. When you were talking about farmers and stuff, I don't know the particulars here, but I know in lots of places, credit unions were things that Catholics were often deeply involved in at local levels. Sometimes they were industry-based, sometimes they were ethnic-based, depending on the makeup of the community and the needs in the time and place. But those kinds of things. I don't know where you live. Where I live, credit unions are a big part of the banking scene in Saskatchewan. They're still, now they tend to be amalgamating. because this goes to the
Yes.
earlier questions we had about scale, and they're competing with much bigger sort of international financial institutions. And so how much of their character can they maintain when they're fighting in those arenas? But anyways, it just struck me as one that's probably overlooked a lot.
Yes.
But credit unions actually have a lot to do with a lot in common with Catholic social teaching and the kind of problems that they're invented to solve, right?
Right. Correct. Credit unions are the kind of enterprise, like I was very involved in a consumer food cooperative. I was on the board of directors for 10 years. I never expected I would be on the board of directors of a $20 million food store. Yet that was a great opportunity. And it certainly wouldn't happen if I bought my food from some national or international conglomerate.
Right.
But we can, in fact, run a grocery store for a community and sell really good food.
So this gives me an idea, and I'll finish with throw out a couple thoughts and get your thoughts, and then we'll wrap up this portion of the podcast, and we'll have a couple bonus questions for David. If you're a member of the Making Every Class Catholic community, you can submit your questions in advance, and we have a couple questions that were submitted for today's recording. So we'll record those after, and that will be available to the members in the extended version. But I'm just thinking now, as you're talking about the grocery store, health class and nutrition, and we hear about food deserts and these kinds of things nowadays, right? Communities that don't have access to healthy food, and you've got a nutrition question, a health question, and then you've got a social studies and an economics question. Very often what happens when people are trying to teach from a Catholic point of view is that the things that divide one discipline from another start to break down. And so you get cross-curricular work. And something like a food cooperative is like health and social studies, and also like business and math.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you're going to have to bring all those things in. So I'm thinking in terms of like a capstone project or something that would be oriented around questions of Catholic social teaching, but that would touch on a whole range of different disciplines, right?
Yes. And I think finding instantiations of those in your local or regional economy are really helpful. And I would simply flag, they don't have to necessarily be cooperatives or credit unions, which is a kind of banking cooperatives. They can be privately owned businesses where the owners have a different sense of the enterprise that they're engaged in. These are often family businesses or businesses with a particular social commitment, where they treat employees well in a particular way, or they serve the community in a particular way. Finding those and showing those to students so that they can see that that's possible, I think is very important.
I've heard some beautiful stories there was an insurance company that was a family-run business that was just a beautiful Christian witness for like 3 generations in like some small town in Idaho or something. Very often our vision of business is so predatory, that we don't often think of it as how it can contribute to the common good. But of course, in a Catholic school, we want to be able to give those pictures. Let's wrap up by inviting our listeners to share their ideas in the comments. If this has got, your brain churning about different things you might try in your classroom or in your Catholic school, tying Catholic social teaching across a few different curricular components, I think that would be a really exciting thing. David, let's put the wraps on this sort of public-facing part of the podcast. It's been a delight to have you here. I knew this conversation would be stimulating. I always get so excited by these ideas. I talk too much, but it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Making Every Class Catholic podcast.
Thank you for Brett for doing this. And Catholic social teaching, it's an endless resource.
Yeah, we could do it again. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Like, subscribe, share this with a colleague. And if you're interested, sign up for our community and catch the extended version that we'll be recording in just a second here. God bless everyone. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.